All we had left to barter were the last of my father's suits. When we were most desperate, father once again asked his friend Wojciech, who lived outside the ghetto, to sell one on the black market. As before, after taking a cut for himself, Wojciech gave us the remaining coins. Other Jews were better off than we were. Some had come to the ghetto with money or jewelry that they could trade for food. A wealthy woman in the apartment above ours occasionally asked me to run errands for her. One day, when I returned to her apartment, she took out an entire loaf of bread and cut off a thick slice for me as payment. I watched in astonishment as she liberally spread butter over the bread. It never occurred to me to eat this unexpected treasure all by myself. Instead, I took it straight to my mother. She scraped off the butter, cut the bread into thinner slices, and then spread the butter on each smaller piece. The whole family shared in this rare treat. That was a good day. Without valuables of our own, my family's only hope to fend off starvation was work, since work meant food. Maybe soup at lunchtime, sometimes a small chunk of bread to take home. Each of us contributed however we could. In return for food, Sally continued to repair hot plates and other electrical items. Later on, he worked in Miriam's father's small brush-making business, which produced all kinds of brushes, bottle brushes, shoe brushes, and large brushes for scrubbing. He also did piecework at home, earning a little money for food for each item he produced. Pesa worked at the electrical company outside the ghetto, and from time to time she too brought back bread or a potato or two. My mother cleaned the offices of the Jewish Council of the Nazis, who had offices inside the ghetto. One day my father summoned the courage to ask Schindler to hire my brother David, then 14, to work in his factory, and Schindler agreed. Every day father and David would leave and return together, sometimes with morsels of food or a piece of coal. Now I stood between them each evening, hoping against hope their pockets weren't empty. Thanks to Selig, who was always looking out for me, I too started working for the brush maker, stringing bristles through a board to make brushes for the Germans. Since I was only 12, it might seem that I was young to be working full-time, but I didn't think of myself as a child anymore, nor did anyone else. I needed to contribute to my family's survival any way I could. Did our family talk about the future or make contingency plans in case the situation got worse? In fact, we didn't. We couldn't think 2 minutes ahead when all our energy was concentrated onto surviving to the next day. We stayed in the moment, determined to make it through the day unharmed. I kept up my single-minded obsession with finding food to the point where I had no time or room in my mind for any other thoughts. Our goal was staying alive long enough for the Germans to lose the war and leave defeated. My father may have been terrified for our safety, but he kept his feelings hidden behind an impenetrable expression. He rarely spoke, and some days barely acknowledged us. He would return from a long day of work, empty his pockets of whatever he had been able to get, and then collapse into bed. In contrast, Mr. Luftig remained outwardly cheerful. If we had a piece of coal burning in the oven, he would sit in front of it and warm his hands with one of his pipes dangling from his mouth. This was his greatest pleasure, even though the pipe was empty. Sometimes my mother would break the silence and state what we were all thinking. How will we make it through the winter? She asked repeatedly to no one in particular. How will we make it? I had absolutely no idea. At Schindler's factory, my father picked up rumors about the war from the Gentile workers. He pieced together different bits of information from which he could track the movements of the German army and speculate on what the Allied forces in Europe, led by Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, no longer a partner with Germany, might be planning. Although we continued to hope the German army would soon be defeated, we couldn't begin to know what would happen next. The scraps of information we received were frequently contradictory. Then in May 1942, we had our first taste of even worse suffering to come. The Nazis announced there would be a transport from the ghetto to the countryside and encouraged us to volunteer to leave the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions for the fresh air and open spaces. Some 1,500 Jews volunteered to go, thinking that anything must be better than the squalid environment they were in. By June, however, the Nazis were past the nicety of asking for volunteers. Instead, they demanded that all non-essential Jews which meant mainly the elderly and those without jobs, vacate their apartments and leave on the transports. So far, my father's work papers from Schindler's factory had protected our family from deportations, but the Luftigs were not so fortunate. With little belongings, they were ordered to pack. With little warning, they were ordered to pack their belongings and report to the main square of the ghetto. There was no time to help them prepare or even exchange goodbyes. As the deportation proceeded, I rushed downstairs to the shoemaker's apartment to get a street-level view of what was happening. Scores of our friends and neighbors, including some of the boys with whom I'd studied Hebrew and watched the makeshift comedy skits, silently walked down the main street toward the train station. I peeked over the windowsill and searched for the Luftigs. Eventually they trudged by, suitcases in hand. I meant to wave, to send an encouraging sign, but I froze in fear when I saw German guards marching beside them, prodding them along with their rifles. Mr. Luftig stared straight ahead, showing no emotion. Did he see me out of the corner of his eye? I couldn't tell. I could only hope. Gradually, the Luftigs disappeared from sight, swallowed in a sea of thousands. I remained in my spot by the window until the last of the deportees passed by. Then, with a heavy heart, I climbed the steps to our apartment. "They're gone," I said sadly to my mother, telling her what she already knew. "He left you this," replied my mother, handing me an old-fashioned glass-lined thermos bottle. Then I pulled back the blanket separating our side of the room from the Luftig side, and I saw that he had left something else. His exquisite pipes. A tremor ran down my spine. Mr. Luftig had determined that whatever his destination, he wouldn't be needing his pipes. It was a disturbing omen. A week later, the Nazis had another train waiting and began to round up more Jews. Evictions, they called them, not deportations. This time, the deportees didn't go quietly. Escapees from earlier deportations had furtively returned to the ghetto with stories of trains filled with people entering a camp and leaving empty, even though the population of the camp never increased. The more first-hand accounts we heard, the more we began to realize what was happening. It was terrifying. So the next time the Nazis started rounding up Jews, chaos erupted. Soldiers rampaged through the ghetto, demanding that people show the required identification and shoving anyone who couldn't into the streets teeming with fellow unfortunates. On June 8th, German soldiers burst into our building and once again forced their way into our apartment. They shouted, "Schnell, schnell, fast, fast," as my father shakily presented his work permit. He'd gotten the Bleichenschein, a blue sheet, a Gestapo-issued permit added to his identification card, which we hoped would again exempt us all from deportation. Now that Salig was 17, he needed a Bloschein of his own. Tragically, he did not have one. If only we had a few minutes' warning, we would have found a way to hide Salig, but it was too late. I felt my blood turning to ice when I realized they were going to take my brother. In a split second, the soldiers pounced on him. I wanted to scream no and leap to his rescue, but I knew it would be suicide, and I knew I would be endangering all of our lives. The soldiers pinned Salig's arm behind his back and shoved him out the door. Then in a span of a minute, my beloved brother was gone. I've replayed those minutes in my head countless times. We should have been better prepared. We should have had a hiding place and practiced to be ready for such a situation. But the roundup happened to us as it did to so many others in the ghetto, without warning and with no time to prepare or react. The shock of Salig's arrest hadn't begun to register when he was already gone. 70 years later, I can still see him in my mind's eye as the Nazis dragged him from the room. In the film Schindler's List, there's a scene where Oskar Schindler rushes to the train station to save his accountant, Isaac Stern, who had been seized in a roundup. Schindler reaches the depot barely in time to yell Stern's name and pull him off the train just as it starts to move. What the film doesn't show is another scene that Schindler told my father about afterward. As he was frantically searching the cattle cars filled with people looking for Stern, Schindler spotted Salig and recognized him as his worker Moshe's son. He ran to him and called and told him he would get him off the train, but Salig was there with his girlfriend Miriam. Since no one in Miriam's family was working for Schindler, there was nothing he could do to save her. Salig told Schindler that he couldn't leave Miriam. This is the kind of young man he was. He wouldn't desert his girlfriend, even when it would have secured his own safety. In the next days, we heard the train had gone to a camp named Belzec, where rumor had it people were being gassed. I remember wondering, how long will Salig be able to hold his breath in the gas chamber? Will it be long enough to survive? All I could do was pray that somehow my dearest brother had been spared or found a way to escape.